How's your career going?
It's this last. What was it? Is it like a year since I spoke to you last? Has it been that? It's not been that long.
With Kashuta?
Yeah, we did one with Alex, didn't we? But the first one's got to be like a year ago now.
It's more than a year.
Anyway, last year's been kind of a wild ride. I mean, in a way, it hasn't. I've just been sat in this room mostly, writing stuff
and doing performances.
Doing mum stuff. And occasionally, I turned up in Florida. That was an outing. That was an experience.
What were you doing in Florida?
I went to NatCon. Did I not tell you?
I did not hear that.
I spoke at the National Conservatism Conference. It was wild.
Okay. Wait, like international or national? So you're talking a bunch of Americans then?
Yeah. I mean, it was a conference of all the kind of intellectual wing of Trumpism.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might say that's a contradiction in terms. I disagree, but I don't really. I try not to use the T word or discuss the T word or really get involved in any of that stuff if I can avoid it.
Okay, so if you take Trump out of the equation, what do we have left?
It's a good question. I think you're probably better qualified to answer it than I am, to be honest. I mean, I'm a far distant observer of what's going on in your country, and it seems to me that people on your side of the pond are kind of losing their minds a bit, perhaps.
And you're not?
Well, I don't know. There are loony factions, but on the whole, I don't know. But I mean, Rainy Fascist Island is kind of mostly okay, I think. In some respects, at least. I mean, I live in small town Britain, and it's sort of all right here. I don't feel like we're in a sort of unhinged state of political polarization. It sort of creeps into everyday life a little bit sometimes, but not massively. I line up at the school gate with other mums. We don't talk politics. We talk about our kids. I'm sure people have different opinions about stuff, but people don't get cancelled in my ordinary life. I don't know.
Well, it's really difficult to parse.
I'm completely insane about COVID as well. Or at least your kind of your Zoom your laptop class seems to have lost its marbles collectively about COVID, and sort of tried to turn it into a sort of a new kind of purity regime. Where it seems really extreme. Like I don't know, you just don't see that so much over here. It's a lot more kind of moderate. We don't really have vaccine politics. Everyone just went and got the vaccine.
Okay.
And as a result, we haven't had mandates. They've just repealed all of the COVID restrictions. It's over in Britain. Everyone's like, well, a few people are complaining, but for the most part, it's going. I hope, touch wood. But yeah, there's a chance that the lunacy might be over. But there are some parts of the world, notably Canada, where it seems like the less intense the pandemic gets, the more intense pandemic discourse gets, and I don't really understand what's going on there. But that's definitely a thing.
Canada is if you take America and you call us crazy, then you have Canada, which is basically America without Trump or anything from the right. And Trump's basically a Clintonian Democrat if you look at his actual policies, other than the WWE or WWF branding and pugilist rhetoric in the sheets, and the actual, when it gets down to business, he's just wheeling and dealing and going for old style American exceptionalism. But I don't know why people had such a strong reaction to him, other than it was not in the best interests of the elite managerial class to have somebody that wasn't a part of the regime. Obama, Clinton, Bush, all perpetuating all that stuff. So
what do you think is going to happen? I'm curious to know what it looks like from where you're sitting. What's coming down the pipe, politics-wise, in the next couple of years.
It is going to be wild. I'm really kind of my best case scenario is that Clinton and Trump run against each other again. It would great, so great. But having Kamala and Clinton duke it out for the next Democratic slot will be interesting. But I think Kamala is going to be sidelined. She already is. I don't know. So it's wide open what the Democrats are going to do, because their current head of state, or figurehead, insofar as he has a head and is able to maintain a presidential figure, is not going to last. I'm surprised he lasted a year already. So we'll see what happens. And I can't tell what's astroturfed, what's inflated, and what's actually authentic when you talk about American political discourse. It's really difficult to parse that.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes whether it's just me being an outsider that makes that difficult to parse, or whether it's just the same for everybody. I mean, you guys leave your... it's like you mic yourself up and then have a sort of massive collective marital argument with the microphone still on and broadcasting to the entire world. So we get the backwash loud and clear. But it's never completely clear to me whether it makes no sense to me because I'm an outsider, or it just makes no sense. I don't know.
It's just kind of chaos. Which could be fecund, it could be generative, but it's been pretty destructive for the last few years with regard to activism kind of leaking into every major endeavor or institution of our political arena. But speaking of ideas, I'm curious, from your point of view, what conservative means. What does that actually mean? Is it not liberal? Is that what it means? Is it defined purely as a reactionary movement, or has some sort of positive circling back around to traditional values and then renovating them some way to make them adaptive to the present state?
I think that's the idea.
Of the world.
Whether that's kind of workable or not is the sort of second. I suppose those are the two questions. Three maybe. There's what has conservatism? What's the conservative tradition? Is that workable now? Or as Sora Bahmari might have put it, just a way of losing more slowly. And is it? What's the prognosis for that kind of dialectic going forward? There are many people better informed on political theory and the conservative intellectual tradition than me, who you might usefully ask this question to. As British and American traditions differ considerably as well, and that's important to grasp. For one thing, we have a constitutional monarchy, which makes a big difference, at a very fundamental conceptual level, and we don't have a constitution, which also makes a key difference at a fundamental conceptual level. In a sense, you guys are already in hock to a series of liberal presumptions from the word go. So perhaps the Ahmari accusation makes more sense from where you're sitting than from where I'm sitting. If you've got 1,000+ years of stuff that might or might not be worth conserving, that's a different conversation than if you're constantly going back to have a look at the papers that were written by the founding fathers and a few centuries ago. This isn't a competition. It's just to say that puts you in that gives you a different set of parameters for thinking about what it is you're trying to conserve and why. And as far as I can make out from an American point of view, once you start extending that tradition back into the various migrant origins of the various peoples who came together to compose the United States, then you're into some quite sensitive territory, in terms of, ethnic conflicts and, colonial history and just the really volatile stuff. So I suspect that most people don't like arguing constantly, and so you just draw a line at, okay, this is where it started, and everything else before that we just don't really talk about. Well, this is my sense, again, as an outsider, and it's a different picture altogether in the UK. Our equivalent Ground Zero. You're not going to get the long answer on.
Oh, are we going to Magna Carta? Are we going somewhere to Chaucer? Are we going back to Caesar landing on the shores, or Beowulf?
You could go all the way back to I don't know. Probably go back to William the Conqueror if you really wanted to, but there are still people who, more or less ironically joke about how we should actually just kick out the Normans, and that was where it all started to go wrong. And you can make that case if you really want to. But no, I was actually going to say Ground Zero in sort of quasi-constitutional terms from a British point of view is probably 1688. Was when we kicked out the last absolute monarch and installed a constitutional monarch. because at that point we had a sort of absolutist ruler in theory, but in practice, the absolutist ruler was always subject to Parliament, and so it is this sort of very strange, this strange paradoxical holding in balance of. It's a way of holding in balance the fact that politics can't ever be completely democratic. You sort of need a bit of absolutist grit in the oyster, because otherwise the whole thing just very easily teeters over into tyranny. At least in my view. You only have to look at what happened in the Reign of Terror after the French Revolution. You see that egalitarian, idealistic revolutions of the people can very quickly go pear-shaped. And if there's one thing which I think sums up the sort of British pragmatism, which is subsequently, I think, being expressed in conservatism, the British form of conservatism, it's that okay, we're going to conserve a little bit of autocracy in the interests of being mostly democratic, and just coming up with a messy solution like that actually kind of works in practice. I think that's just a very English way of doing it. It doesn't make sense from a high theory point of view. But from a sort of holistic point of view of history and human nature and just whoever it is you're arguing with at that point, it kind of works, and after that people just get used to it.
Okay.
And so in as much as there's an English conservative tradition, I would characterize it like that. It's stuff that people sort of cobbled together because it worked, and it's sort of and to the extent that it carries on working, people carry on doing it. And once that sort of tips over into becoming grand unifying theories about how the world ought to work, it starts to go a bit. Starts to not be quite as effective. And I suppose, in as much as, to address, I warned you this is going to be the long answer. If you're, what do I think is the prognosis for that going forward? Sohrab thinks that conservatism has become just a way of losing more slowly, because he thinks it's in hock to too many of the presumptions of liberalism, which is just relentlessly hungry and determined to liquefy everything. And therefore, if you're conservative, all you're doing is standing athwart history, yelling stop. But if you've already signed up to a belief in history and progress, then you're screwed, basically. And all you can ever really do is slow it down and sort of wish for a return to a period 5 minutes before whatever it is that's happening right now. so that's the kind of post-liberal critique of conservatism as a stance. Yeah. The jury's out for me on whether that's all there is. I've joked and played and experimented with the phrase reactionary feminist over the last year, partly just because it's fun. It's a nice phrase to play with, but also as a sort of placeholder for the possibility that in fact conservatism is toast. And if that's true, and I'm not completely certain what I think about this yet, if it's true, it's because the entire liberal settlement is toast, because that was an effect of the industrial era and to an extent the print era as well. And we've now left the industrial era for the digital era, and in the process we've also left the print era. And the whole, most of the founding premises of liberalism, the marketplace of ideas and free equal debate and the autonomous subject and so on and so forth, that whole nexus of ideas, the sort of classical liberal ones, they're impossible to sustain except in a sort of semi-industrial print culture. In the internet, in a discourse that's structured by people reading off the internet rather than reading out of books or pamphlets or whatever. It just doesn't work anymore. There's too much information. The information is too networked. People watch memes evolving live pretty much in real time. You can see a meme develop, at sort of at warp speed on the internet over the course of 24 hours. And it's just not possible to hold to the ideas of a stable, objective world that you need, in order to sustain the kind of the framing premises of the liberal subject. So the whole edifice of liberalism is being rotted from the inside by its own invention, the internet.
And would you insert postmodernism into there, like the postmodern
yes.
thinking process? And is there things to take from postmodernism to
right? Absolutely. I mean, in a sense, it's hard to say what came first, but they've certainly acted as an accelerant for one another. That way of thinking and this form of technology Jeff Schellenberger is great on this. Taking a sort of materialist analysis of the sort of the kind of post-truth critique, rather and saying you can take the material conditions of the 20th century and the scientific discourse and you can put those pieces together. That is Jeff's argument, and come up with postmodernism being kind of inescapable, the inescapable upshot of that. The sort of stance of chronic skepticism, where you just don't believe that anything is real anymore. I mean, he sees that as just being the sort of the logical endpoint of a bunch of stuff that now believes itself. It all gets very recursive at this point.
Yeah, I catch myself too. I even brought that up in this conversation. What's going to happen? I don't know to what degree is it madness or is it. Okay, I don't know to what degree America is going mad and to what degree we're simulating madness because we don't have anything better to do, and to what degree I should take that madness seriously, because when I go and I interact with my very small community, we're just trying to get through the day, right? And you see these ideas kind of leak in, and you say, well, okay, gender stuff, where is that going to lead? All these different topics. You guys don't have to deal with race, but the madness of America is, I don't know to what degree we can take it seriously and to what degree I can assemble my stance toward it without just kind of disregarding the madness and trying to be sane in a mad world or trying to be crazy.
A lot in the advice that people get, just be normal, go outside, touch grass. There's a lot in that. These things become easier to bear or easier to kind of put in their place to the extent that we actually remember to do that. I do a lot of long distance running with that aim partly.
What's your mile time at this point?
I mean, it depends on road or off.
Okay.
And I run kilometre splits rather than miles, so that kind of. But I ran my first marathon over the last year, and I got 4:04. If that gives you an idea.
Marathon's 100 kilometers. How many kilometers? 26?
26.2 miles.
Okay.
I did 4 hours, 4 minutes, so that gives you an idea of over distance. I can run 6 miles in about 55 minutes, so I'm not fast. I just like it. It's like doing a nice country walk on fast forward. What was I going to say? I was going to say something. I don't really know what kind of politics will emerge to make sense, that will make sense to the kind of subjects that are emerging now out of the internet.
Are you talking about subjects as in individuals or subjects as in topics?
Subjects as in the conceptions people have of what a person is. Yeah. If you understand what I mean. Mm-hmm. Because the internet doesn't just change how we relate to one another. I mean, I'm sat here in Britain talking to you, several thousand miles away. That's kind of mind-blowing. It's in itself, and I'm looking at a simulacrum of your face. And all of these things cumulatively, they shift, they make great and small adjustments in how people think about, how people understand what a person is. And I think it's no coincidence. I'm sure I've mentioned this before. I've written about this. It's no coincidence that transgender identities, or these ideas that the idea that identity can be completely unmoored from embodiment, has just mushroomed in conjunction with the internet. Because if you give a medium to a whole bunch of people, children really, which enables them to conduct almost all of their social life online with no reference to their body whatsoever, and let them curate self-presentations, which can be updated at the click of a button, just by changing your avatar picture. Why would you be surprised if they then imagine they can edit their meat avatars as well? It's kind of a no-brainer. They would think of their selfhood as being separable from their embodied self, and lots of them are going to conclude, if they're actually just unhappy in their physical selves for whatever reason, that maybe the solution is to edit their meat avatar. And why would you not want to do that? And I can also see, when you look at it from that point of view, how grossly unfair it must seem that a bunch of middle-aged women like me are coming along and saying, well, no, actually, you can't do that. It doesn't sound like I'm reminding them about the kind of the parameters, the actual parameters of reality, which can't really be argued with very easily. It sounds like I'm just mummy denying them something for no reason, and it's just really just mean and unfair of me. I don't know what you do with that, but I think a lot of the sort of mutual incomprehension is to do with people, the people who've grown up with that disembodied selfhood paradigm, and the often older people who are saying, well, no, actually that doesn't work. And particularly older women are saying it doesn't work.
Well,
because,
and are you saying that because you're just behind the times, or because you have some sort of insight?
Benjamin, I've been very online I've been extremely online for 20 years. You know, I was fully signed up to all of this stuff. I mean, I'm probably, you know, I'm not the first generation to be extremely online, but I'm the first generation to be extremely online in the mass social media age. You know, I've had plenty of time to think about these things, and I've run through most of these responses to what it means to be a person socializing online. I'm also old. I've had children. I've had plenty of time to think about the fact that you know, nothing nukes mind-body dualism more than experiencing PMS. You know, for 25 years in my case, longer, 30. You know, 30 years of PMS gives you plenty of time to reflect on the fact that actually your body affects the way you look at the world, and vice versa. You know, these things become more obvious as you get older, and you know, really nothing scrambles any idea of mind-body dualism more dramatically than having a child. I mean, I could go into that and give you chapter and verse on that, but I'm digressing a bit from the point, which is that older women are pushing back against this stuff because we just have a much more direct experience, I think, of it being not true. And it's frustrating to find that dismissed
not
as
true or not feasible, and can technology take care of that feasibility?
No, I don't think so. I think you just end up you just create new problems. You know, mind and body are not separable. Full stop. You know,
Okay.
we're never going to be uploading our consciousness into the cloud. It's not going to happen. You know, that's not how minds work. It's not what minds are. Minds
so
aren't.
far, I mean,
No. It just isn't. It's not how. It's not what minds are. You know, minds are the neurons. You take away. You know, minds aren't a sort of, you know, a form of information that's flowing through a kind of meat network that we don't fully understand well enough to replicate yet. Minds are the neurons. You take away the neurons and upload it into the cloud, it's not a mind anymore. I don't know, maybe you can upload that data, but it'll be something else. It won't be mind.
yeah.
We're never going to upload human minds into the cloud and have them still be human minds. And even if we could upload all of that information, you take away the embodiment, and, you know, do you still even really have a human mind? I mean, these are the hard problems of consciousness that, you know, you have to be much cleverer than me to kind of try and get to grips with. But it seems pretty obvious to me that, you know, who I am is structured to an almost, it's almost completely structured by the shape I am. And this idea that we can disaggregate mind from body, and furthermore that body is inferior to mind and ought to be subject to its every dictate, I think is deeply destructive. You know, in all kinds of, and it has negative knock-on effects in all sorts of directions. But I mean, the most immediate and upsetting one, from where I'm sitting, is just watching adolescents mutilate their bodies, particularly young women, because it's just intolerable trying to be a young woman in the world at the moment. And I watch young women, you know, signing up to butcher themselves in this way or that, you know, in the sincere belief that it's going to make life better. And sometimes it kind of works out all right for them. But then there's this growing chorus of detransitioners who I look at and I think, my God, well, you know, what have they allowed you to do? And these poor women are going to have to live with 5 o'clock shadow and permanent sterility and chest scars and just no normal physiological function, and being on HRT from the age of, you know, 22 or something for the rest of their lives. And it's horrific. And it's all downstream of believing that we can separate minds from bodies, which is just false.
Okay, maybe that's where this conservatism begins then. If you build your conservatism on that, maybe you have something to stand on. Instead of, it's not reactionary and it's ancient, so it is going back to that, but you also have this more research and more science. Science can get along with that. Science can actually function in that. The liberal subject can, as long as they allow themselves to be subject to that, then liberalism on some form can happen, or at least conservatism has some sort of place to go and return to.
Maybe it's possible. I mean, I'm not at all sure that you and I mean the same thing by reactionary. Well, that's probably the beauty of the word. I mostly use it as a placeholder for the fact that I don't believe in progress.
Yeah. I don't know what I don't mean it like you're alt-right or you're some sort of essentialist or anything like that. I still don't know what that word means.
The guys who believe in ethno-nationalism or whatever are actually kind of quite progressive. They see they see all of that stuff as being radical revolutionary stuff that they need to bring about in order to in order to affect a higher and more enlightened state of humanity. Which is in its own funny way, it's quite sort of French Revolution. To me, they have more in common with the progressives. They've got their ideology, which they want to sort of jackboot down on the world, and some of it looks to me like it speaks to human nature, and some of it really doesn't. So I don't know. I think sort of right wing racist progressivism is in the mail. And it will be structurally not dissimilar to the progressivism that we currently have. I don't really consider myself to be pulling in the same direction as those guys, though. That's not my jam.
But is there you say that you don't really believe, or you're not sure that progress exists. Is there a functioning sort of enlightenment or responsibility that the subject has to overstand their physical nature, to control that, to incorporate traditions or practices or habits of mind that subject the body to the will? Is that kind of functioning alongside it? And also being a woman with that PMS thing that you've suffered and the child rearing thing, that kind of changes things for me. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around how you and Erica Bakayoko and other females, conservative females, if that's the right term, are trying to reorient the liberal project around care and not around autonomy centrally, but around community or something other than that doesn't go in a Marxist communalism direction.
Yeah, Erica's book, I think, is tremendously important as a sort of revisionist historiography of the feminist movement. I've been mining her endnotes gratefully and quite thoroughly for my own writing project, which is underway at the moment. The working title is Feminism Against Progress, as you might do. And it picks up on some of the same themes as Erica's work, in that, I'm arguing that feminism as we understand it is a response to the industrial age, because prior to, a central component of feminism is about trying to get to grips with how women navigate the competing demands of family and work. That's been a central feminist preoccupation from the word go. And that just wasn't a problem to the same extent prior to the industrial age, because most work happened in households. So it just the balancing work and family thing just wasn't really a thing until we invented the workplace, and the workplace is to a significant extent an artifact of the industrial era. And one trend which I think is interesting is the extent to which virtualization of work actually reverses that again. And at least for some people, at least for the laptop classes, and so this is, to be clear, this is not the case for all occupations by any stretch. For the laptop classes, that actually opens up the possibility of returning to a sort of 21st century version of productive households on a much more sort of 14th century model. And some of the most interesting young American conservatives, by which I mean under 25 or under 30, are the ones who are looking to create a life which is half remote work and half homesteading. And that's a thing now. That's where people are more and more kids are trying to do that. Trying to find a patch of land where they can grow their own vegetables, and then the other half of the time they mine Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. That's a whole other subculture, which I think has the potential to get much bigger. I mean, it's obviously not going to be for everybody, because there are some occupations that doesn't fit. But for obvious reasons, that's much more compatible with, a much more integrated professional and family life. I mean, there's a great deal more you can do with kids underfoot if you're able to work flexibly from a laptop like that. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that I see. That's one sort of positive development I see coming out the other end of the industrial era. But where Erica's work and mine converge, or one of her themes, which I find interesting and also very challenging, is her argument that in feminism has, I mean, I'm paraphrasing quite brutally here, because her book is nuanced and very scholarly. But as I read it, her argument is that there are sort of two poles, two themes that recur throughout early arguments over how we navigate work and family as females, and one of them. One of them was sort of oriented around care and domestic life and family life, and the other was about individual autonomy and sort of emancipation of the self from all surrounding relationships. Yeah. And the back and forth between those two poles is a tension which is there in feminist thinking and feminist debate pretty much from the word go, from the 18th century onwards. This is not a new argument, and one of the ways I think Erica's work is interesting is because her take is that tension, that back and forth, that tension is no longer there within the feminist movement, because it was won conclusively by Team Freedom when abortion was legalized. Because in a sense, if once you've accepted as a sort of foundational premise of your movement that in order to have access to personhood on the same terms as men, you need to be entitled to kill your own unborn child. You have conclusively come down on the side of autonomy against dependency. There's just no other way of slicing. Once you've entrenched that in law, your legal system has come down definitively on the side of autonomy. Of course, that's nuanced by different qualifications on the legislation in different geographies and so on. But as a fundamental principle, I find that argument difficult to disagree with. What that means in policy terms, or what that means in where you go with that as a feminist, I don't know yet. This is something I'm still wrestling with. But I find her argument persuasive. In a way which has challenged me deeply, actually, reading that, thinking about it over the last year.
How so? What are some of the things that you've had to revise about your previous point of view?
Well, I've always been very much in the safe, legal, and rare camp. But it never occurred to me that actually maybe it just shouldn't be a thing. But at the same time, I've always wrestled with and been very frustrated by the sense that care and dependency are tremendously important values and tremendously undervalued values, and that actually a constructive case for women that wasn't just trying to be men on the same, trying to be people on the same terms as men, is just signing up to the male default, ought to have a go at trying to find arguments for revalorizing care, and just bringing those two things into collision with one another. The possibility that in fact, it's logically incoherent to be for care and also for safe, legal, and rare. I've found quite difficult. I found quite challenging as a proposition, and I don't know what to do with that yet. That's very much a kind of live source of reflection for me. Mm-hmm. But just stepping back from that to the theory level.
Can there be an enlightened dependency? Is enlightenment and emancipation and individualism and freedom and liberty all wrapped up together? Can we have enmeshed enlightenment? And I still have to figure out what I mean by enlightenment, but there's something reactive and constructive about a certain mentality that came about in the modern era.
I mean, I don't see why not. One of the things I want to argue for is that actually one of the most constructive things we could do we could try and do, in order to repair some of the difficulties, but try and find better ways for men and women to live together, is abolishing big romance and bringing back a much more practical medieval idea of what marriage is.
What do you mean by that? Let's talk about this pre-romantic romance.
Why do I think we should abolish big romance? I mean, people have always fallen in love with, there have always been people who fell wildly in love with one another. You had Antony and Cleopatra, and Dido and Aeneas. It goes all the way back to ancient times. There have always been wild, intense love affairs. But it wasn't usual to choose your life partner on the basis of who you fell wildly in love with, until relatively recently. And one of my theses is that that idea that we should really valorize romantic intimacy and mutual regard in that way was a sort of consolation prize which women claimed in exchange for the loss of economic agency that they suffered at the beginning of the industrial era. We talk a big game about feminism having empowered women economically, since really the 20th century and the re-entry into the workplace. But what that misses is the immense loss of economic agency which women suffered in the transition to the industrial age.
Could you sketch that for the random passerby?
I mean, in the 14th century, I was actually just writing about this today. I found this great 14th century poem which recounts an argument between a ploughman and his wife. I'll paraphrase because you don't need Middle English on your podcast, but it recounts an argument between a ploughman and his wife, and he says to her, you lazy bint, you just lie around all day, and playing with the kids, and your work is really easy, and I have to go and toil and sweat in the muddy field and look at a pair of horses' asses all day, etc. And my life is much harder than yours. And she's like, no, actually. I have to keep an eye on the kids, I have to make cheese, I have to feed the animals, I have to weave cloth, I have to make clothes, I have to tend the garden, then I have to feed the animals again, then I have to make sure the children don't die by falling in the well, and I also have to get your dinner on the table by the time you get home. So next time, how about we swap places, and you can try and do all of that stuff and make sure the children don't kill themselves in the process, and I'll go out to plough. That's the poem. The rest of the poem is lost, so we don't know how it worked out in the end. But I'm willing to bet that he burned the dinner.
Yeah, but did she plow the entire field or 25% of it?
Who knows? Who knows how the poem ended? But it's a safe bet that it ended with a sort of greater mutual respect for their complementary and equally challenging and skilled roles.
And the market value of those two roles were more or less equivalent. Creating children and running the home is just as valuable as creating the wheat that gets you the milk. You have to bear in mind that it wasn't a market society at the time, and most exchanges didn't take place within a sort of a financial. Most things weren't traded for money. So plenty. The life was full of exchanges and mutual obligations and debts and so on, but most of that didn't take place under the sign of money. It took place in terms of I do this for you and you do that for me, and so it's difficult to measure. But the family needs clothes to wear. The family also needs food on the table. Of course they're equally necessary because they're equally parts of a subsistence lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So that's your 14th century ploughman's wife has plenty on her side of the ledger when it comes to what materially am I contributing to the household, but that changed when work moved mostly out of the home and into workplaces. Because somebody still had to look after the kids. It's all very well doing a bit of spinning or weaving with a toddler underfoot if you're at home, and doing all of those other things as well. And it's a different ballgame if, in order to do that work, you have to go to a factory several miles away and clock in and clock out, and the machines are big and dangerous, and you can't have toddlers running. It's a completely different ballgame. And all of a sudden, you're facing a much starker set of decisions about how you work and in what capacity and what you can meaningfully do, and how you're valued. Right, by and how culture, yeah. And so of course, and then the equivalent of the ploughman comes home and says, well, Mrs. Wife, what have you been doing all day?
And she might say, I've been educating the kids, and I had so and so, I've organised for us to have a nice social, and I ordered some new curtains, and I don't know, or I went and I started a committee for improving the local area. But it's all much more, it's much harder to measure. So, and also she's not earning any money of her own, and so if her husband turns out to be an asshole, she's in a bind. Because she can't, this is still a world, say the 19th century, where you can't get divorced. Your husband has legal power over the children. You're not allowed to own property. Your legal person is subsumed into that of your husband. So if you don't have any economic agency of your own, and also your husband is a dick, you really have a problem. So it was not it was not unreasonable for women to start campaigning for property rights and suffrage under those circumstances. And romance, because if you want your husband to not be an asshole, you want to make sure he loves you. So in a sense, a relationship which was based on pragmatism, and I make the cloth and I make the cheese and I look after the animals, and you go out there and you plough the fields. You can get quite a long way just on the fact that you both have work to do, and you're just too busy to think about, did he buy me flowers recently? You're just too busy. It's just, whether or not your husband, remembered to get you a Valentine's card is just less important in a world like that. But, all of a sudden, if you're completely economically on the back foot and you have no political personhood, I think I wouldn't want to marry somebody where I wasn't sure if he loved me or not either. So in a sense, big romance kind of became really important. Became much more important for women. And you see it in the literature of the time. A huge amount of the work of Jane Austen, for example, is, those themes of, making sure it's not just a relationship based on sex. I mean, this is the Pride and Prejudice story, isn't it? Lydia goes off and she just gets really horny and goes off and marries a completely unsuitable young man. And then there are other characters in other books who marry somebody who just turns out to be a cold fish or just not really very nice. And, the relationship between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy is all about that mutual intellectual respect, which serves completely to offset the fact that he actually has all the power economically. But because they have this relationship of mutual love and mutual respect and sort of high moral regard for one another, you feel like it's probably going to be okay in that case. So that's kind of best case. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy is pretty much kind of ideal best case scenario for how life is going to work out for women under those circumstances.
And you'd have to erect around that all these courtship rituals and litmus tests to see if it's a right partner, and then you have this entire industry of personality.
Hello, just an entire industry, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think again that's increasingly not that's increasingly not the world we live in the sense that, actually, I don't often say this, but the men's rights activists kind of have a point when they complain that women are perfectly capable of earning their own money, but they still expect big romance. Because in a way, it doesn't make sense.
By which you mean by which you think that they mean that these men mean that they shouldn't be held to this more or less impossible standard if that standard was erected in order to compensate?
I think just very, very straightforwardly, why, if you're not kind of dependent and vulnerable in these ways, why are you still expecting me to go through all of this romantic rigmarole, which was kind of premised on that being the case? I mean, there's a slightly back to front way of phrasing it, or just to put it much more bluntly, why should I buy you dinner when you earn more than me? And it's kind of a fair question. Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer to that, and it's a long time since I was dating. But in a sense, the means for and the expectations for how people are meant to behave with one another take a lot longer to change than the material conditions that serve to structure them in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what that looks like in the future. But one encouraging trend I see in slightly more out there corners of experimental, very online 20-something culture is, people are starting to talk about arranged marriages again. And if your objective is to put together a productive household, then it's not a bad way to go about it. Because actually what you need in a productive household, by which I mean, one where the work of raising children and perhaps producing food or earning money all kind of happens more or less in the same location, with a collaborative effort by all of the adults living in the house, on caretaking and the various other jobs, in whatever configuration makes sense. That's what I mean by a productive household. And if your aim is to have a family life that looks like a productive household, then actually it's what you need is what you're looking for in a partner is quite different. In the sense, you need shared values. You need a fairly clear understanding of what your common goals are, and you need a measure of pragmatism, because if you're just too busy, if you're gonna send your partner to Coventry for a week because they forgot to buy you a birthday card, then that's kind of a problem, if you've got animals that need to be.
Is this some sort of weird Hallmark movie Chaucerian reference or something?
No, it isn't at all. It's just I'm picking cards as a sort of fairly light-hearted example of the sort of romantic gestures.
Yeah.
Which matter a lot to a lot of people, but in a sense, I
was riffing on the sending somebody to Coventry. I was just wondering if that's a Chaucer reference.
No. Yeah. Sending, that's just an English turn of phrase.
Okay, yeah. So so to kind of try to formulate this, if we're premising relationship on productive household or a productive household, that would have to become the conservative ideal, or that would be packaged in what are we conserving? What are we building? We would have to make an argument, maybe now's not the time, that a man and a woman or two partners functioning together to produce and raise children and also to make money, if you can hang a lot of your hat on that, or you can hang quite a bit of hats on that. And then
can I just stick my hand up at this point and say I don't really think of myself as a conservative.
Okay. But you keep on talking about it. You're just conservative adjacent? Is that what's going on?
Sorry?
Conservative fluid? Is that what's going on?
I don't know. I find we can argue back and forth about abstractions. I mean, it's maybe if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it actually just is a duck. Okay. And maybe I should stop quibbling about it.
I'm thinking of conservatism as some sort of stable societal or stable cultural understanding that's not premised on progress. That's not premised on.
I'm interested in. I don't think there's much left to conserve at this point. And I'm much more interested in the idea of what we might reconstruct. Okay. Because I really don't, I don't think there's very much left of social norms around how people live together. And so there isn't much left of norms around family formation, or really anything much at all. And given that, I honestly just think it's a much more useful question. Given where we are now, what. How can we best live together? It's pretty wide open. And abolish big romance, I suppose, is one of the things I might offer on that front. But it's more of a reconstruction suggestion than a conservative one as such. Okay. Because from a let's keep things as they were until 5 minutes ago, the conservative argument is that we should go back to having breadwinners and stay-at-home mums, which to me is just a ridiculous idea.
You want to go further back? That's not
trad wives are nowhere near trad enough. They're not trad enough. They're literally like trad. It's a very modern idea. Mm-hmm. The stay-at-home mum. Mm-hmm. We need to go back to the 1450s, not the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And the 1450s trad wives. I've used the term trade wives. They're a very different, very very different creature. Mm-hmm. I'd rather see a world of trade wives than trad wives. I mean, if it's your thing and your partner earns enough, fine. You do you. But I think for a majority of women, I seem to remember somebody did some research on this. The statistics suggest that there's maybe 20% of women who just prefer to be stay-at-home mums and not work at all. And there's 20% who just want to go balls out and just spend all of their time on career. And a lot of those women don't have kids. But the remaining 60-odd% would prefer a mixture. And I kind of feel like that population is under-discussed. or underrepresented in the sort of noisiest factions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And well, that was kind of raising my curiosity about how do we what's the narrative around a woman who accepts care, birth giving, and career? Like, what is how do you make that into a cultural narrative that can be rallied around? And maybe that's not your intention or your desire to do that, but I'm just trying to say, what's the romance of being both and? What's the power of that? What's the greatness of that? And what's the difficulty of that? And it seems to be really difficult to sell that. So what is that about? And it's something that you do. It's kind of your life. You're a mother and a thinker and a runner and all these other things. And a lot of the story is that you can't have both or something like that. I don't know.
Well, I should say I'm extraordinarily lucky in that I do, my occupation is something that I can do from home. And I'm very emphatic about never wanting to work in an office again. And that's just not the case for all occupations. There's not. So I'm very fortunate in that way. And I wouldn't want to suggest that I believe my template is one that you can just roll out willy-nilly to everybody, because that's obviously not the case. But actually, I mean, the person I know who's smashed it most out of the park when it comes to work-life balance is actually my hairdresser. She's just absolutely nailed it. She's converted their garage into a tiny hair salon with one seat. I mean, in every detail, it's got all the kit, and it's got the flock wallpaper and the giant mirror. It's got everything. I mean, it's been beautifully done. And her commute is like 12 feet from her front door to her garage, and she works there. She chooses the hours she wants to. She works within school hours, or when her mum is able to babysit, or when her husband, and she works the hours she wants to. She has no commute, very few overheads. And she has good time. Yeah, she earns some money. She enjoys the social contact, and I mean she's kind of nailed it. And I think, but can you imagine the brickbats that would be thrown at you if you were to suggest to any sort of average young woman of average intelligence that actually if you want to be a mum as well as have a career, you could do worse than being a hairdresser? Can you imagine what would get thrown at you if you suggested that? As though there's something demeaning or inferior about having what to me looks like a pretty nice life. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of, I don't really know what you do about that. Yeah. There's the prejudices and the presumptions about what does or doesn't constitute meaningful work are very entrenched, and they're very biased towards a certain kind of person.
That's changing so much with the internet, and the influencer culture is one thing, which is kind of like you either make it in there or don't. But I wonder to what degree there will be so many other different online-ish careers that are opening up. You learn some code, you do some that from home, you do some gig, you learn how to write well, you do marketing, stuff like that. There's so many different other things that are white-collar work. But again, that's kind of divorced from the work of the body and other industries too. And that's also classist with people. Somebody's going to have to be the Amazon delivery driver. Somebody's going to have to,
right,
package all those things until we get self-driving cars.
Yeah. I mean, you can drive yourself crazy trying to come up with a universal solution. And I'm not sure that there is one.
Okay.
I think it's a category error trying to be universalist in your feminism. You just have to try and be honest about situating yourself wherever you are.
Okay.
Humans are a sexually dimorphic species, but what is or isn't in women's interests is so contextual that the same policy could be feminist in one context and anti-feminist in another context. It's not possible to be universalist. I think it doesn't make sense trying to do that.
Okay, but you wouldn't say that you're not a feminist.
No, I'm absolutely a feminist. I very much care about. I think women have political interests. It's difficult to say that we have those in any sort of universal sense as a class, but our physiology is politically salient. In any given context, and it's not it's socially constructed, but it's not a social construct. If you see the distinction.
I do. I use this thing called English, which is socially constructed.
Right.
But
I mean, but what I mean by that is that it's we give it, we give biological sex, so we ascribe social meanings to biological sex, some of which are more or less loony. But that doesn't mean that you can't then loop that round on to say that actually that just means biological sex is invented. That's obviously not the case.
I don't know. They're trying to convince the world that. I mean, that's the prevailing ideology or idiocity right now. But is there
I get frustrated with this idea that just because something's a social construct that's some sort of great gotcha. It isn't.
I don't know what to do with that.
Of course, money is a social construct. So funerals are a social construct.
Education.
Well, furniture is a social construct. That doesn't mean chairs aren't real, or that I shouldn't go to my dad's funeral. It's just a stupid way of trying to undermine ideas that you have a beef with. And I think people should just be more honest about having a beef with whatever it is that they have a beef with, rather than saying, we should make that go away because it's a social construct. Because literally, almost all of our culture.
Yeah.
In some way, so whatever.
I see it's going to be cropped out of the final recording, but I see you have Helen Joyce's trans book on your top shelf there, and I had a conversation with her right when that came out about what is the definition of woman, and she reduced it biologically. I'm like, that's not going to be salient. It's still, whether we like it or not, gender is going to be invented. There's going to be social meaning placed on the female, and maybe your tract is correct. There's no universal woman, but there are cultural salient properties of a woman. There is a British woman or a certain woman in your class, in your domain. There's a meaning to that. And so that's the question that I have about gender. I'm a kind of a gender positivist, or so. I'm gender positive. It's going to happen. It's going to mean something. So why don't we think about it and see how it's enjoyable, see how it's bent, broken, and rearranged, but how we're eventually going to snap back to there's a meaning to be a man, and there's a meaning to be a woman. I wonder if that's interesting to you, and how that would help make the political project or the political salience of women also socially salient too.
I think one of the reasons we're arguing about all of this stuff at the moment is fundamentally because the material conditions within which men and women negotiate how best to live together are changing so quickly.
Okay.
An equivalent argument happened at the beginning of the industrial era. There was a huge amount of discourse then about the proper relationship between men and women, and the proper sphere of men and women, and what sex roles ought to be, and so on, because it was all suddenly up in the air, and it was being negotiated in real time between people who had to find ways to live together. Where the rubber hits the road is when you have kids and you try and raise kids together, and how it hits the road is straightforwardly how you organise the tasks involved in family life. That's the nuclear core of why sex roles. Everything else, there's a certain amount of it has to do with courtship, but the nuclear core of sex roles is about how you negotiate family life and why. Okay. And that's totally contextual. Some of it might be rooted in women and men's different physiologies, but it's totally contextual. And those sex roles are going to be radically different if you live in a hunter-gatherer tribe in the Amazon jungle, or if you live in Manhattan. Obviously they are. And if you live in Manhattan, there isn't a very substantial need for sex roles, full stop. Because most people do knowledge work, and you don't really, it makes no meaningful difference what sex you are if you do knowledge work, at least until one of you gets pregnant anyway.
Knowledge work. I haven't heard that one before.
Well, you know what, yeah, I do. If you're a member of the laptop classes, it's just, what sex you are is relatively unimportant. But if you live in the Amazon jungle or in the 1450s, it's considerably more important for a bunch of reasons which ought to be obvious. And I think a lot of the reason we're having these interminable, tedious arguments about gender is just because actually it's a lot less important than it used to be for a lot of the kind of Zoom class people who are having the arguments. In a sense, the internet has cucked all of us.
There's the Mary Harrington zinger.
And by that I mean, the guys who go on about, real masculinity and aesthetics and slunking eggs and whatever, are still, they're still posting thirst traps, just like an Instagram e-girl, or a lot of them are anyway. And in a sense, they're not, the men and the women just aren't so different, because they're all arguing like high school girls in Twitter slanging matches. And to the extent that everybody's just involved in this constant game of backbiting and Chinese whispers on social media, there is no meaningful difference between the sexes anymore. I mean, just to expand on the idea that the internet has cupped all of us, my thesis is, it's observable and sort of fairly well documented that female aggression is much less direct than, women are just as aggressive and competitive as men, but they go about it differently. Joyce Benenson is good on this. Men tend to be fairly overt in their competition and in forming hierarchies. And, when men, come into conflict with one another, there's a higher possibility of physical violence than there would be among women. But once you transfer all of human interaction onto the internet, you foreclose the possibility of physical violence. And in a sense, it means that all conflict now happens in the female key.
Everybody's bitchy and bitching.
Yeah, the internet has cupped all of us. Even the guys who are being the loudest about masculinity are still forced into the female key when it comes to fighting, as long as they're doing it online. I think if men really want to reclaim masculinity, the best way they could start doing it would be to log off and hang out with one another more. And don't tell women about it.
Why not?
I'm going to move on from that question.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, no, it was. I was interested
because I'm a big supporter of single-sex spaces, and I think that should go for both sexes. I think is the short answer. We can't very well say that women need to be able to protect our changing rooms and refuges and so on from people who identify as women but still have a meat and two veg. Unless we're also going to stick our necks out and say, well, no, actually, men need some single-sex spaces too. Because I think men do. I have no idea what men talk about when there are no women around, but I assume there must be stuff that they want to talk about when there are no women around. Because there's definitely stuff that I prefer to talk about when there's no men around. So It seems likely, right? So I think we could. So I think there's a feminist case for bringing back all male spaces.
Letting men go their own way to a certain distance. Letting men go a certain distance their own way.
Maybe men going their own way to the pub with each other and then coming back.
Well, one of the responses to that.
It's not such a radical idea, really, when you put it like that, is it?
No. Well, no. I saw there was some discourse about the male kind of backlash to the female protecting their own spaces kind of thing. They're like, well, you took all our spaces away. And then the argument that I've seen from women is that, well, we wanted access to the halls of power because all the men were in the back rooms making all the decisions that affected everybody else. If that's, I don't know to what extent men getting together have the power to shape society in ways that don't benefit women because they exclude women. So that's an open question. But with the internet, with transparency being as it is, so many decisions do get made in public and are multi-sex discussions. And that's another problem that we have. That's probably we're wasting a lot of bandwidth on trying to figure out these communication styles between men and women and then also within the online space.
Yeah, I suppose the one thing I'd say about the halls of power is that that's a lot of different kinds of all-male spaces sacrificed just so that a very few elite women could have an equal crack of the whip. And if you're one of those elite women, I can completely see why you'd want to do that. But if you're insisting that the cost that it's an acceptable trade for you having an equal crack at the top slot, whatever that is for you, becoming a QC or or whatever that means for you, is that effectively most single-sex spaces have to be abolished because sexism. All the way down to just random guys somewhere in Stockton on Tees who no longer get to have their boys' club doing this, that, or the other, because some barrister somewhere felt like she was a bit left out of the office chat. If you look at that, down through the class hierarchies, I think there's a tension there between the needs of an elite minority and perhaps the needs of a sexed majority.
Mm-hmm.
That's possibly a provocative thing to say when you wargame out its consequences, but it's something to consider.
Are you in the frame of mind that class should be abolished, or is class another thing? Classism, like with regard to emancipating women, trying to equalize the classes is just not something that's valuable, fruitful, or possible.
I'm not completely sure how you go about trying it. I mean, I don't really know. They say real communism has never been tried, but it seems like it kind of has. And what emerged was a different elite.
A shadow elite. Shadow class.
Yeah. Sort of a much more mystified elite, but everybody still knew what they were or who they were. And they even had a name for them. The nomenclatura. Who were the names? The people with special privileges. The insiders. In the Soviet Union, they still had a ruling class, and everybody knew it. But bottom line, no, I don't think you can abolish social class. I don't think it's possible to not have an elite. And pretty much the best you can hope for is a responsible elite that feels a sense of solidarity with and obligation to the rest of us.
Do you think that Britain's gone some way with being able to pull that off? To get back to what we were talking about 1688 and Comstock, or whoever it was that did the thing with the other guy.
I think I'm not massively enamoured with our current ruling class. I guess there's always a sort of gap between the ideal and reality, isn't there? Some members, at least, of the royal family do a fairly good job of leading by example on that front. The current crop of parliamentarians, leave a little bit to be desired when it comes to showing by their actions that they feel a sense of solidarity with the rest of us and an obligation to the rest of us. Whether it's ever likely to get any better, I don't know. But I think demanding that of the people who govern us is a better bet than trying to not have anyone govern us, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Just from a sort of realist point of view.
Yeah, I see the breakdown in American politics between just accepting that Bezos is going to have 99.9% of the money, either accepting that or demanding that nobody has more money than a certain amount. And I don't think that the Bernie Sanders, there should be it just doesn't make sense that we're going to cap wealth. But it's the same thing with status and who is the elite, who's not the elite. We're always going to have an elite, but how porous is that elite and how removed is that elite from the concerns and the livelihood of the commoner or the middle and the lower class? And if we can get them to maintain dialogue, I think is a higher ideal than to pit themselves against each other. I don't think pitting the classes against each other is going to be fruitful. I'm thinking unifying them is probably the better way to make it. That's just my point.
I wrote something recently about COVID hygiene theatre, or hygiene protocols over the last couple of years, and the extent to which they've revealed social hierarchies, which have been some decades in the making. The new class structure which has emerged in the wake of financialisation and deindustrialisation in to an extent in Britain, but much more markedly in America. And I was very struck by this when I went to Florida. That was what really started me on this whole train of thought. Because Florida, it's kind of mask optional, or relatively mask optional as states go, and it left me thinking. It was, for example, all of the staff in the hotel where I was wore masks all of the time, but the guests didn't, or for the guests it was optional. But then, as it happened, I escaped one lunchtime with Chris Arnaud, who's a lovely, lovely guy, who took me for tacos at a dive taco place, just off the kind of tourist land bit of Orlando, where normal people live and where normal people go out to eat, which is a completely different atmosphere to, right, exactly. And nobody in the restaurant there was masked. The servers were not masked, and neither were the people eating. And I put that together with a story that came out of Ivy Getty's wedding, which you may or may not have crossed your radar. This is a descendant of John Paul Getty, the oil tycoon, who's in her late 20s, I think, now. And there was a big piece that was written up in Vogue about her wedding, which went on for days and was just insanely, decadently, crapulently extravagant. And there's this little vignette that the write-up in Vogue, IV drips for people's hangovers at the picnic after the pre-wedding party. It was just really just off the charts. You've got to read it. But the detail that stuck in my mind is the moment when everyone, all the attendees for the wedding are all seated there in San Francisco's City Hall, and the bridal party sweeps in along with Nancy Pelosi, who officiated the wedding, and everybody ritually puts their mask on, apart from the bridal party and Nancy Pelosi, who did not. And it left me thinking about the class, the status significance of COVID masks, and the way in which who has to mask and who doesn't, in what contexts, has come to speak very eloquently for differences in differences in rank, effectively, between the social classes. And I, as a member of the Zoom class, traveling to the United States, was very aware of being sometimes high status enough to be exempt from masking and sometimes not, because it just depended on the context that I was in. But I don't have enough clout. I'm not high enough ranked to be universally exempt from masking, where one of the Kardashians of this world absolutely would be. Do you remember when there was a kerfuffle on the internet because Kim Kardashian flew her entire family to a private island in the middle of the first lockdowns, and threw a big party there? And she was tweeting photos from this private island, and they're all sort of arms draped round one another and having a great time. And in the background, there's the masked staff clearing empties from the tables, and it's all there. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm talking about. So yeah, I mean, when you're, but I thought a bit more about this, and I thought, yeah, you can see this very much steeper sort of stratification in social class. With all the kind of the people who can't work remotely are right at the bottom of the food chain, and amongst eating out amongst others of the same social class, probably nobody's going to mask. But the moment somebody like that goes to work, then the whole protocol comes into play, and that's just compulsory. It's obligatory. You go a bit further up the food chain, and people are either able to kind of crazy isolate themselves and become kind of COVID maximalist neurotic types, or else you can enjoy kind of partial exemption from being masked when you're in certain circumstances, like you're a guest in the hotel, for example. Mm-hmm. But on other occasions, you're subject to it all again. And it's only right at the top, in the 1% of the 1%, that people can just kind of breeze through, and that none of these regulations really impact you at all, mm-hmm. because you fly everywhere on your private jet, and just none of the normal rules apply. Mm-hmm. None of the rules that apply to everybody else really apply to you, or you can just throw money at it. Yeah. This is, so this is, just through the mask hierarchy, you can see the whole sort of digital age class stratification just suddenly visible. But it was already there, is my point. It wasn't as if COVID masks made that happen. They just made it visible. It was like It was like a like a barium meal when you go for one of those when you go for one of those scans to see whether there's something wrong with your insides. They make you eat them.
Like charcoal or something?
Something in ultraviolet, and then the light makes it stand out. The masking kind of had that effect, and think something was visible that had actually been taking shape for a very long time. Really, since the Reagan era, I think. Since Thatcher and Reagan started dismantling the yeomanry, or started fully kind of liquefying the middle class in the interests of progress or something.
Mm-hmm. Growth.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Never-ending growth. So those are my thoughts on social class in the COVID era. Is there any meaningful sense in which we can disassemble elites in the context of that? No, I just think that's, well, if you've got an idea about where you start, I'd like to hear it, I suppose.
Well, it's interesting because if, insofar as progressivism is a form or a descendant of Marxism, insofar as wokeness is a descendant or a reassemblage of activistic morality about emancipation and equality and etc., and then that's pitted in, there's a privilege and a underprivileged class, and we're going to do a bunch of work doing that. If you see what happened with that stuff, it's that the actual elite encased themselves in that. They protected themselves by adopting it, and then they get to go around and say, Michelle Obama can intimate that the poor drug-addicted Virginia white kid has more privilege in a certain respect than she does, right? And so and then with the Cortez showing up with that tax the rich dress at that gala, it's just it becomes more and more glaring. So I just don't know if there's any way to challenge that system by making it some sort of resentment-based class politic. I think that the best way to do is to try to unify all the different classes around a common humanity. I don't know. That's what I would like to happen, but I don't know if that's sellable. I don't know if that's doable. I just don't think resentment's the way to go. I think that's how it will be torn apart, because once the populace latches onto resentment, the elite are just going to adapt that resentment to protect themselves and have the populace tear each other apart. That's what you have.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me.
So, and probably the same can be overlaid with the sexes. A lot of some of your brilliant critiques is showing how a lot of feminism is just elite. It's an elite game that actually shatters everything below it, because it's about power. It's not about finding some sort of way to live together, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess I would add to that in as much as there are arguments coming from men and women both, which boil down to thinking that all of our relations with one another should be reduced to transactions, or that actually what we need is the final victory of one sex over the other. I would class that as also under the politics of resentment, and I would argue that that's never going to get us anywhere. That it's not going to. That there's no meaningful way that kind of politics serves our common interests as people. And what I like, just returning to Erika Bakioki's book, what I like immensely about her work is that she won't abandon the idea that in fact men and women are different. The sexes exist. If that's a material reality. And we may have normatively different inclinations and possibly also flaws. We have different reproductive roles, but we have a common capacity for excellence and a common human dignity. And if you start from that premise, then you think, well, actually, the questions we need to ask are probably about, how they start with how can we live together, given our shared and sometimes competing interests. They don't start with how can I defeat those dickheads over there.
Yeah. Because
that's just going to cause those guys over there to get really cross because you just call them a bunch of dickheads and say, how can we defeat those bitches over there? And all of a sudden you have war, and welcome to the internet. I mean, that's 90% of Twitter is just men and women having that argument at the moment. It seems to me sometimes.
There's another problem with.
I don't see that anything good can come of it.
Yeah, but there's a downside to Bakioki's excellent critique. I mean, she's a Catholic, one thing. I don't think you have to go religion, but once you start to say, well, we have common excellence and we have common dignity, that opens up the question, well, how can we be acting better, and how harder can we be working to maximize our own excellence and then participating with each other beneficially. And one comic, I think you posted this comic. It was this. It was two panels. The first panel was a bunch of people standing outside of an abortion clinic and saying you're killing babies, and then it was the same people, but instead of a woman walking out of an abortion clinic, it was a man walking out of a porn theater or something like that. And the backlash to those, like, you're killing babies, you know. So there's this mutual respect that happens, and then this mutual calling to each other, the sexes, to show up for each other and to sacrifice for each other. And then that asks a whole bunch of questions about what are we willing to give up to return to a more stable relationship. What kind of selfless sacrifices.
Liberated enough. We all need a haircut when on the freedom front. We all need to take a bit of a freedom haircut. We're all liberated enough. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on that because I'm writing a whole book about it, and I'm going to get absolutely cancelled when it comes out. But I think we all need a freedom haircut. I'm going to say about that for now.
Well, on that note, then, what can people look forward to from you in 2022? You got more. You're going to do more of these Turning Point USA tours and stuff like that.
I have not done a Turning Point USA tour, Benjamin. That's a vicious calumny, and I reject it. What am I going to do? Well, for the next 6 months, hopefully that's how long it'll take me. I'm going to finish writing Feminism Against Progress. I don't know how quickly it will turn around after that in terms of whether it'll come out this year or next year. But I'm basically saying no to any writing commissions. My New Year's resolution, apart from the unheard column, or insanely well-paid commissions, and you're welcome, anybody who wants to send me an incredibly ridiculously well-paid commission. But apart from those, I'm basically saying no to everything now until the book is done, and I'm really excited about it. I've been writing it in public in a sense for the best part of 2 years, but I've put the whole argument together, and it's going to be lit. I'm really excited about it. So actually, I just want to get my head down and write that. And when that comes out, then I'm going to get royally cancelled, which I'll either love or hate, or maybe a mixture of both. I don't know. I guess I'll be around on podcasts. The column's still there, unheard. But that's priority number one: is get the book done.
Any high points in your internet life for the past couple of years, then, since you came out as a feminist against progress, or?
I don't know, the whole thing's been brilliant, to be honest. I mean, it's. I've had this crazy opportunity to just write absolutely loads of stuff, which has given me a chance to work through my ideas and meet some fascinating people and have superb conversations like this one. It's been a wild ride so far. I don't really know what's going to happen next, but I just feel like I have to remain deadly calm and carry on writing stuff.
With regard to the book, is it? You have an argument. Is it going to be kind of a treatise, or are you going to have a lot of anecdote or historical? You've read a few of my pieces. They're usually a mix of contemporary stuff and a bit of history, a bit of materialism, a bit of literature, and a bit of me, and just kind of stir that up and try and make it not too dry. That's usually what I'm aiming for, and it's hopefully going to be kind of that vibe, I guess. Genre smashing, just like the postmodernist.
Well, not really. Actually, lots of people write like I do now. But I mean, it's kind of theory, but I want it to be nice to read as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? You are a startling thinker. I always enjoy your work, and you were actually requested to come back on my show. So you have a roving fan base, or a raving fan base out there.
Yes. Well, hello, Benjamin's guys and girls. Thank you for inviting me back. It's been great.